So welcome everyone to the IPAN inquiry, and this is the last in this particular series on the Australia-US Alliance webinar series. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, traditional custodians on the land of which we meet today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. A brief word on etiquette. Please remain on mute and submit any questions you have in the chat space. This webinar will be recorded. And now I would like to introduce our very first speaker and chair of the People's Inquiry. And Kellie Tranter will introduce the inquiry and why it's necessary. And a brief word about Kellie, which I just received. Apologies for that. A little bit of a technical issue there. So Kellie is a lawyer, a human rights activist, and of course the chair of this very important inquiry. Welcome, Kellie Tranter.
Thank you. Thanks, Michelle. Firstly and importantly, I wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, in my case the Wurundjeri people. I pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past and present and to leaders yet to emerge and acknowledge the land was never ceded. I welcome you all to the last in a series of webinars on the U.S. Australian Alliance and the IPAN inquiry. So many people have worked hard to pull this inquiry together, the first of its kind, and to give you a chance to have your say on the matter. And I thank IPAN and specifically Annette Brownlee, Sam Brennan and Jonathan Pilbara for their tireless work in constantly pulling all the parts together. I wish to thank and acknowledge all the supporting organisations, too numerous to mention individually, listed on the website. Thank you to the panellists, Greg, Jeannie, Chad, Alison, Peter, Ian and Vince, for giving your time, energy and expertise to this important inquiry. To date, as I understand it, we've received 100 submissions. Submissions close on Monday, the 16th of August. So those who are yet to make submissions should get started now. You still have a small window in which to take advantage of this very unique opportunity. And I say it is unique because for too long, the Australian public has been sidelined from the debate relating to Australia's defence and foreign policy, particularly in relation to the alliance with the United States. Our foreign policy is not publicly discussed, let alone democratically decided. Just imagine if the decision to go to war was decided in Parliament on a conscience vote where evidence is tabled and debated about the purpose, costs, benefits and consequences of military action. Would universal or even majority support ever be achieved for our involvement in military incursions at the behest of the United States or the legitimisation of its illegal actions? When it comes to defence and foreign policy decisions, there is a very narrow discourse in this country. There appears to be some mysterious, effective understanding stretching across political leaders, establishment media and public servants that there are some things that it wouldn't do to say or think. What we're left with is a yawning gap between public attitude and government policy, and a demonstration of this was the Lowe Institute's recent annual poll of over 2,000 people, which found that the majority do not want Australia dragged into military conflict between China and the United States, with 57% saying Australia should remain neutral in such a conflict. And yet the government takes actions of enormous consequence with little or no public debate. David Brophy, lecturer in modern Chinese history at the University of Sydney, reminds us that, quote, the US Marine rotation in Darwin has risen to 2,500. To Darwin's east, millions of dollars are being spent to upgrade port facilities that can accommodate American warships, with some advertising these facilities as a possible base for the US Navy's revived First Fleet. 300 kilometres to the south at the Royal Australian Air Force Base at Tyndall, Morrison plans to spend $1.1 billion to extend runways and enhance support capacity for US B-52s. Roughly $1 billion will also go to purchasing Lockheed Martin anti-ship missiles, And defence hawks are lobbying for Australia to either acquire or permit America to install intermediate range ballistic missiles in the Northern Territory. And of course, there is Pine Gap to add to that mix. How is any of this consistent with the majority view that Australians or Australia shouldn't be involved in a military conflict and should remain neutral? The importance of this inquiry is its ability to create an alternative narrative or vision to the one that has us shackled to the archaic idea that a unipolar world will exist indefinitely. It gives each one of you a chance to elevate your voice above the current toxic political discourse, to contribute to helping our country reinvent itself independently of the United States, to revisit our history with honesty, and to help our country take responsibility for and determine its own foreign and defence policies. We must decide as a nation what's in Australia's national interests and press for that to be put into effect. If the Lowe Institute poll is any guide, the need for this is obvious, given the disparity between what politicians and bureaucrats are doing and what citizens actually want. So please take advantage of this opportunity, and we look forward to reading your submissions. And on that note, I hand the floor back to you, Michelle. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kellie. And we will shortly, is Greg actually, has he joined the seminar?
I have, yes.
Excellent. Hi, Greg.
Hi, Michelle.
So Greg is the inquiry panellist for the area of political, including democratic rights. He's a democratic and human rights barrister. He's also an advisor to the Julian Assange campaign, past president of the Australian Republican Movement and the Australian Lawyers Association. Welcome, Greg.
Thanks, Michelle. Thank you, everyone. And firstly, can I pay my respects to the custodians of the land, in my case today, the Boonwurrung people and Wurundjeri Wurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nation. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I note this is unceded land. So in terms of the democratic rights issue, I think since we gathered for the previous seminar, there have been, sadly, a number of developments. I think one of the most important is the fact that the High Court ruled 4-3 in favour of giving the federal government the ability to indefinitely detain people who are in immigration detention, and particularly those people who have had their visas revoked. It's extraordinary that a government would seek such a power in a democratic society, but not surprising, given where Australia has drifted on this issue since Tampa. What's also displeasing, of course, from a lawyer's point of view, is that the High Court has become so conservative that there were 4 judges who allowed that to happen. But it points again to the lack of human rights charter at the Commonwealth level, which of course would mean that in nations such as Canada, for example, or the United Kingdom, that legislation would not be possible. And rightly so. In no society, civilized society, should people be allowed to indefinitely detain a person in circumstances where they have not committed any criminal offence. And even then, of course, it's a matter of conjecture. The second issue that I want to address in terms of democratic rights relates to recent developments which my colleagues at the Australian Lawyers Alliance have picked up on, and that is the misuse of COVID data. As we know, governments now are insisting on people signing up to an app, and essentially they're able to track the movements of people, all of us, 24/7. In Western Australia, in Queensland, in New South Wales, in Victoria, we have seen examples and admissions by police that they have misused that data. In the case of Western Australia, to the credit of the McGowan government, it passed legislation to prevent this from happening. But I think that one of the erosions of there are a number of erosions of democratic rights through COVID, and that's not suggesting in any way I'm a COVID skeptic or an anti-vaxxer, or I'm leaving aside those broader issues. But what I'm talking about is the erosion of democratic rights And the fact that that erosion of democratic rights, including, for example, the Covert app, have an awful habit in this country of becoming permanent features of the legal landscape. And you don't see them ending. So in terms of that, I'd be very interested to see submissions from people in relation to that issue. The third issue is the issue relating to the lack of accountability by government, increasing lack of accountability by government through the parliament. That is government, the executive arm of government, increasingly treating the parliament with contempt, doing so in a number of ways. But I think one of the most troubling aspects is the way in which the estimates process, a very valuable process, is being abused by this current government so that it effectively doesn't have to answer questions. And I think one of the issues that emerges from that is whether or not we ought to be strengthening the estimates process so that people are on oath and that the oath means something as it does in a court of law. That is, that if you lie, you can be cited for perjury. Perjury proceedings can be brought against you. Now, some people might think that that's difficult to enforce in the context of Parliament, but we know, and I mean, Kellie knows this in particular, having assiduously been after the government in relation to Julian Assange and the mistreatment of Julian Assange and what the Australian government knew, a constant stonewalling, a constant prevarication, and a constant slippery half answers. So I think that, you know, the accountability of the executive arm of government to the parliament is something which is, again, like so many aspects of Australian democracy, being eroded. So they're the three areas that I think are emerging, have emerged in recent times, and I think that would be very useful to get some submissions in relation to them. Particularly, as I say, I have an interest in the COVID issue because it seems to me the unprecedented collection of data provides police with an extraordinary capacity for gathering of intelligence. And we know that police forces routinely abuse their powers. Not just police forces, though, of course, but security agencies such as ASIO. They're cowboys. They routinely abuse their powers, and there's a real danger that this is going to occur, and in fact has started to occur in the context of COVID. So thank you, Michelle. Unfortunately, I can't stay tonight because I've got another function, but they're I think the three issues I wanted to flag, and I'd be very keen to see. Thank you to those who've already sent in submissions. I'm very keen to see some more about this inquiry.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Greg. And I'd just like to pass you over now to the Associate Professor Jeannie Rea, the panellist for the area of unions and workers' rights. Jeannie?
Unfortunately, Jeannie can't make it today. Yes.
So we'll be moving then to Dr. Chad Satterlee. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. Satterlee, how are you going? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so my turn.
Yeah, so
No
Dr. Chad Satterlee is the panellist for the area of economics. He's an independent political economist, and his main research interests concern the design of collective ownership. He has previously consulted for government and not-for-profit organisations on energy and labour relations issues. Welcome, Chad.
Thank you, Michelle. And I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am meeting, which at last I checked was apparently Rio Tinto. But seriously. So the economics panel area, I have received some interesting submissions on that topic. I suppose it's quite an abstract area and a lot of people are turned off by it, but it clearly is an important dimension when we're talking about foreign policy and the trajectory of defence spending and so on in Australia. Just to set the general scene, the most recent budget caused some controversy when a survey of some of the nation's most eminent economists found that a very large majority supported spending on social housing and permanently increasing the dole, job seeker, as their two most preferred ways to get the economy going again post-COVID. At the same time, the real growth in defence spending on the previous year, consolidated defence funding, for 2020-21, I believe, grew 9% in real terms, which is about $42 billion. And Kellie's right, we have a bipartisan target to spend around 2% of the national income on defence, and that's about $42 billion, which means we more than exceeded the 2% target. So that's the sort of contradiction that, from an economic point of view, is confusing for some. And I guess in my brief time, I'd want to just consider perhaps how we can resolve that, and perhaps provoke some submissions on that question, and including the consideration of how we chart alternatives, which is the other important part of the inquiry. So 2% of national income is about $40 billion a year. So that's a structural spend that we do every year on defence and military expenditures. If we just want to be conservative for a moment and just imagine that we had a quarter of that, $10 billion, to spend each and every year on something other than military expenditure, the question becomes, how would we do that? And economists have all sorts of sophisticated answers on how we can do that. You'd spend it on labour-intensive things that increase the productive capacity of the economy, our ability to produce things more and in a more efficient manner. The problem with the economist approach is ultimately that this ignores the interests, and in particular, I would argue, the class interests that would be, well, disturbed if we spent that magnitude of money each and every year on something other than defence. And so in other forums, I've challenged the audience to just imagine you had $10 billion a year to spend on something other than defence. What would you spend it on? Now, again, they tend to side with the economists and say, well, what about social housing? Now, the problem is, first of all, we would have enough housing year on year to solve homelessness permanently in just a few years, in which case you'd be stuck with trying to spend that sort of money on something else. Moreover, it's very difficult to imagine spending that sort of money without frustrating the class interests associated with the property industry. And as we know, that's quite entwined with our major political parties. And so it would be very hard to see us spending $10 billion a year on, say, social housing without, upsetting people who want to build high-rise developments and so on and so forth. We'd also reduce the returns of private investors and their rents by doing so. So that's quite a touchy area. Permanently increasing the dole payment would make job seekers think twice before accepting jobs with bad conditions, and therefore it would probably undermine the class position of employers, which is why the temporary increase to that during the COVID crisis last year has been wound back. That is essentially the reason. If it was a permanent increase, well, then people would think twice and it would undermine the power of employers. What else? Education. Well, the government likes to cut education because you don't want people to be too educated. So it's really hard to actually think of an area where if you're spending that much money every year on something other than defence, that you're not going to frustrate the class interests at the heart of our economic system. Now, secondly, this sort of thing that economists say, that, spend on social housing, it'll stimulate the economy, that sort of stuff overplays perhaps the extent to which those programs would stimulate the economy in the way economists think. If we look at Australian history, during the Great Depression, we got unemployment down to, I think, a record low of 0.95%, which is a record for us. But that only happened after we spent about 30% of the national income on the military. The same story happened in the US, actually. FDR, during the New Deal, spent a lot on introducing unemployment insurance and a whole host of social programs, but that actually, growth continued to decline. Unemployment really didn't increase until military expenditure shot up by over 1,000%. So now, in terms of the evidence, there is a literature that goes into the relationship between economic growth and military spending. And there is some evidence that for rich countries like Australia, there is a positive correlation between spending on military and economic growth, but it's not clear to me where the causation lies. In particular, could it be that we're rich, therefore growing, and have more money to spend on defence, or we're spending on defence, and that's somehow having flow-ons which increase our growth. So the causation is not very clear there. But the issue of class, I think, is central, and it's what economists miss, which is why many eminent economists said that the last budget was just completely incomprehensible and didn't make any sense. Well, if you ignore class, then of course that's not going to make any sense, but if you consider influential social groups and how they influence political parties and so on, then it's very clear that some things are just not going to be considered for spending. For the small number of people who listened to my previous talk, I talked about how the economists would prefer to use cost-benefit analysis to work out where spending priorities should lie in terms of defence spending, and I went into why that's sort of very fraught in technical terms. But nobody in that talk raised what is perhaps the biggest flaw of that whole approach, which is that assumes that the economists are giving advice to the government which acts on behalf of all citizens as a sort of benevolent dictator. We call them the literature. But of course, a lot of people have observed, and I've got a lot of submissions that have dealt with this, of course, they don't do so because in some sense, the government apparatus has been co-opted by this whole defence industry, and the revolving door between defence industry and politics and so on is quite well known at this point. So if it's the case that government doesn't act perfectly in the interests of citizens, the economic approach of cost-benefit analysis and sort of reducing it to a technical question of priorities doesn't quite seem to work. And I was pleased that Kellie raised, the prospect of, well, what if we had more democracy? And I know on war, I think the ancient Athenians, at least for male free citizens over the age of 18, I mean, let's face it, they had a slave underclass, but if you were 18 and male, they voted on whether to go to war or not. And it seems to me that that kind of thing could be an interesting way to circumvent the structural problems within the economy and the relationship between that and politics. But I suppose what I would argue, this is my idiosyncratic view, the only way we're going to redirect social spending towards the things that the economists are talking about, more social justice, increased dole payments on the environment and so on, is if we, we have to target the structural class issues that lie at the heart of our economy, which means we need to democratize that. In particular, spending decisions, investment, where are we going to spend money? That currently sits with private industry and so on, and the special interests that we talk about in terms of military, they are the ones who are directing the spending towards these things that we find are perhaps not socially useful or the most optimal use of social resources. Okay. So we need to democratize that aspect of the picture, and I think if we get a lot of submissions dealing with what people would like to see in terms of that process, referenda, there are lots of suggestions out there on spending, then it's not a given that people, if we all had a say, would choose to spend less on military spending, but it would allow organisations like IPAN to make that case more persuasively, because we would truly have an equal say over spending direction. At the moment, I'm getting a lot of submissions suggesting that those special interests in the military-industrial complex, as some people talk about, are the ones driving the spending decisions. What we need is all citizens to decide on those spending questions. And that's me.
Thanks so much for that, Chad. And I'd now like to introduce to you the panellist for the area of foreign policy, Alison Broinowski, who is the acting president of the Australians for War Powers Reform. Alison is also the author and editor of 14 books about Australia's dealings with the world and Asian countries in particular. Welcome, Alison.
Thank you, Michelle, and thanks to everybody at IPAN for this initiative, for your hard work on this, at dedicating a whole year to getting this thing underway. And it really is to your great credit, and I hope that the results of it reflect that in the way that all of us who are here tonight would like to see. Thank you, Kellie, for your really comprehensive, as always, forensic analysis of what we're all on about. And thank you to everybody who is signed up in this great big lineup of faces, of people who really care about the things that we're concerned about. I need to talk about foreign affairs for you. And this is more important, I suppose, now than it has been for a very long time. We have got used in recent years to not hearing foreign affairs discussed much. Not in our media, not in our parliament, not in many public forums. And there are several reasons for that. It's not that it's not important, but it's because the two major parties in recent times, particularly since 2001, have decided to take a bipartisan approach to both foreign affairs and defense. And a bipartisan approach means that there's no debate. And if there's no debate, then the media has nothing to report. And if there's nothing to report, then the people don't hear it out there. They don't hear the issues. They don't hear what Australia's alternatives to the bipartisan consensus might be. And that means that we've all been deprived for a really long time, the whole lifetime of some of young Australians, the whole lifetime of hearing any discussion about what these issues are. And yet, from the submissions that we have received to this inquiry, people are concerned. People are not asleep. People haven't been lulled into submission and acceptance of this bipartisan status quo. People, for instance, as old as me, who remember the Vietnam War, remember our protests against that. People younger than me who remember our protests against the Iraq War and how our protests against that were ignored. And people even younger, like my granddaughter, are disturbed about what's going on, don't approve of it, want something better. And their generation are entitled to see something better. So that's what this campaign is about. And that's what many of the submissions that we've received are saying. The point is this: foreign affairs are not a remote and negligible issue. They're not something that happens over there, far away, and has nothing to do with us. We are accustomed, we have become accustomed throughout our history to accepting that all the wars except 1941-45 were distant from us, were in countries not close to us at all. And therefore, our foreign relations didn't seem so much to matter. But now, we are in a situation where that is likely, quite likely, to change. We have said for years and years that we didn't have to choose between our American ally and our Chinese major trading partner. That was a lie. Governments had chosen. They knew exactly where they stood, and it certainly was not with China. So now we are in a situation where our foreign affairs are more required than ever to concentrate on that choice. And because the choice has already been made by governments of both parties, we, the people, are more challenged than we ever have been to head off a major disaster for Australia in our own region, which is the first time since 1941-45 that we have been confronted with such a choice. And we are less than ever prepared for it, because what we are hearing from our mainstream media and from our politicians is that China is the enemy. China is the villain. The United States is our ally and our protector. Now, this is in fact a falsehood. People have been led to believe it, but it is absolutely untrue for the very simple reason that the ANZUS Treaty, on which we have relied since 1952 to protect us, doesn't say anything of the sort. The United States knows perfectly well that it does not, and the United States will always, as any country should, look after its own interests first. That's the United States. Secondly, China would, in any case of a conflict, be looking after its own heartland, its own territory, its own mainland. And if that involved the United States would be waging yet another expeditionary, distant war in Asia. And which of those two would be likely to win, do you suppose? The United States itself has conducted numerous war games in which they rack up the likelihood of a conflict between themselves and China, and in every one of their own cases, America loses. Now, that doesn't mean that they should be ramping up their capacity to take on China, because as I've just argued, it wouldn't work. The Chinese would defeat them anyway. So the United States, knowing this, is very unlikely to take on China. But that doesn't mean that it's Australia off. We are now in a situation which we have put ourselves in which we ourselves are ramping up hostility against China. ASPI is, the mainstream media are, and the government is. And ramping up hostility against China is one of the most absurd foreign affairs initiatives that I have known in my entire life. We need to be doing exactly the reverse. What we need to be doing is acknowledging that Australia is part of the same region as China, will be forever. The United States is not. We live here. We need to get on with our neighbors, as indeed our neighbors seek to do with China. They understand the situation. They are here, just as we are here. They do not expect anybody to protect them against China. Even the Japanese and the Koreans are working out how to coexist. This is what Australia should be doing, is not doing, and is behaving like something out of colonial times, when we expected the colonial metropolitan power to protect us and defend us and make sure that we were okay. The real thing that worries me the most is, given the decline of our relations with China, the Chinese, if push came to shove, would very likely use Australia as an example to the United States of what could happen to them if things got serious. In other words, China could attack US bases in Australia, of which we have many, take out Pine Gap, for instance, and take out quite a lot of Australians at the same time, while costing themselves nothing and merely sending to the United States a message about what could be done if they don't shape up. And my guess is that the United States, ANZUS treaty or not, would not have the slightest interest in taking China on over Australia. So let's face the facts. Our governments have said for years we don't have to choose. We do have to choose. They have chosen, and we need to choose differently. Because what we need to do is choose diplomacy over armed force, choose neighborhood alliances, relations over distant alliances, and say to everybody in this country, if we are interested in surviving where we live and getting on with our neighbors, we need to start that now. Now, the exact reverse is what is happening in our parliament. We in my little movement, Australians for War Powers Reform, are trying desperately to make sure that there is a debate and a vote in the parliament before Australia goes into another war. Unless we change the legislation in that way, the same thing will happen again. A government will decide, one or two people in a closed room will decide, yep, we'll do what the Americans want and we'll fight. That means real disaster, worse than Iraq, worse than Afghanistan, worse than Syria, because it's here. And so this moment when IPAN has chosen to focus our minds on this issue could not be more timely, could not be more appropriate. And if what we're all discussing tonight gets out to the wider Australian community as a whole, this is precisely what we need, because our parliament won't do it, our elected representatives won't face it, and it's only support from the public, which people like IPAN are generating, that is going to stand between us and the kind of catastrophe that I'm describing. I don't want to leave you with a terrible, bad feeling, and it's not cheerful, I agree, but we can do it. You know, we're a country that in the past has done all kinds of good things in foreign affairs. We can do it again. One way that we can do it again is to get governments to properly resource the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, make sure that our diplomatic capacity outstrips the capacity of the military to run the show, because the military running the show will be the kind of disaster I've just described. The only way Australia can head that off is by a real concerted diplomatic effort that builds back our relations with China, sustains our relationships with other countries, including the United States, including telling them what we will do and what we won't do, including that we will not go to war over Taiwan, we will not go to war over a rock in the South China Sea. This is what diplomacy is about, and this is what we have to reinvigorate, rebuild in this country, and get ourselves back where we used to be, with a respectable foreign service and a foreign policy worthy of the name. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Alison. Certainly a lot to think about there. Just a quick reminder, if you do have questions, to please enter them into the question area provided, and we will be getting to that after the speakers at about 10 to 7. And now I'd like to introduce you to Lowe AO, who is the panellist for the area of environment and climate change. And he is also Emeritus Professor of Science, Technology and Society at Griffith University and an adjunct professor at 2 other universities. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you, Michelle. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I am. For family reasons, I'm in Brisbane, so I'm on the land of the Turrbal and Juggera people, and I pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. At the outset of this process, I reminded people that Ban Ki-moon, when he was Secretary General of the UN, pointed out that from the contamination of land to the plundering of natural resources, the environment is always the silent casualty of war. And several submissions have underlined specific quantifiable damage that has been done by American wars in which we've willingly participated, whether it's the destruction in Vietnam of 15% of the tropical forests and 50% of the mangrove forests, whether it's the Gulf War where hundreds of oil wells were set alight, millions of barrels of oil were tipped into waterways, and hundreds of tons of missiles with depleted uranium were rained down upon the country. Or Afghanistan, where a third of all the wooded area was cleared between 1992 and 2007, leading to desertification and drought, and damage to wetlands and canal systems that in one case had been there for 3,000 years, has led to an 85% drop in the bird populations visiting those wetlands. So it's clear that there are quantifiable environmental damage that has been done by warfare in which we've willingly participated. The second issue that people have addressed in submissions is the contribution to climate change from the military, from preparations for warfare. The US military's consumption of liquid fuels and contribution to climate change is comparable with a middle-sized country like Denmark. And that's when they're not going to war, when they're just cruising around getting ready to go to war or enlisting Australia's help in exercises like Talisman Sabre. The third issue is the nuclear peril. We already have the environmental legacy of the enthusiasm of the Menzies government to allow British governments to test nuclear weapons on the Montebello Islands, at Emu Field and at Maralinga. And we have the poisoned legacy of areas where, to this day, Indigenous people can't participate in traditional activities. But those are essentially preparation for the unthinkable use of nuclear weapons if there are serious wars in the future. And I remind people that the glib talk about the drums of war and idle chatter about a war between China and the US ignores the solemn reality that Professor Hugh White pointed out, that any war between the US and China would almost certainly merge into a nuclear exchange. And it's a reminder that although things have scaled down a bit since the end of the Cold War, there are still something like 13,000 nuclear weapons arrayed around the world. And even a comparatively modest nuclear exchange involving 20 or 30 weapons being used would not just do appalling environmental damage locally, but would put so much debris into the atmosphere there'd be the real prospect of a so-called nuclear winter, with temperatures plummeting, food production plummeting, and probably the end of civilization. Because every one of those 13,000 nuclear weapons has somewhere between 100 and 1,000 times the power of the weapon which demolished Hiroshima. So their use has really unthinkable consequences. There is now a UN treaty for the abolition of nuclear weapons, and more than 50 countries have signed it. Alarmingly, none of these states which have nuclear weapons have signed it, and nor is Australia, which is taken widely as implicit recognition that we cling to the desperate hope which Alison put in perspective, that if we were in trouble, the US would protect us with their nuclear weapons. I think the scale of the nuclear threat is a reminder that we have to develop civilized ways of resolving our differences. We can't continue the sort of cave person mentality of assuming that physical violence can resolve disputes, when physical violence could mean the end of civilization. And it's also a reminder that for the sake of the environment, as well as the sake of civilization, we have to stop mindlessly following the United States military into ill-considered adventures. We've had quite a few submissions. I would welcome more so that the final report can quantify in more detail the environmental risk of warfare. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Ian. And now we have the panellist for the area of social and community. That's the Reverend Peter Catt, who is the Dean of St John's Anglican Cathedral in Brisbane. He's also President of a Progressive Christian Voice Australia and Chair of the Social Responsibilities Committee for the Anglican Church in Southern Queensland. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight. I'm, like Ian, on the land of the Yagara and Turrbal people tonight, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and those we can see emerging, which is a great gift. It's been a great privilege to be part of this inquiry, and I'm grateful to all the people who've sent in submissions thus far. The society and community area is one where I'm hoping the inquiry will help us uncover some of the stuff that we don't often see. We've just had PTSD Awareness Month in June, and we certainly are aware that there are returned veterans who suffer with PTSD, which reminds us that the wars that we think we fight offshore actually do come home, and then there are ripples of trauma that go through families and communities, and people commit suicide, and we have that trauma just gets carried along. But I think largely the Australian population might see that as one of the only consequences of us fighting wars offshore. But the submissions that I've been receiving for this part of the inquiry are certainly uncovering the fact that there are lots of other implications for us being involved in overseas wars. One of them is a very significant, and several inquiry submissions have raised this, is the fact that we are increasingly getting a disconnect between the people of Australia and the government and the opposition. As other speakers have mentioned, there's a bipartisan support for the current approach to our involvement in what Henry Reynolds calls the unnecessary wars. And that disconnect between the people and the government is actually a deep concern in terms of the way society runs, because we do need to have a sense of trust in those whom we elect. Because after all, we elect these people, and it's not enough for us to say they are doing something wrong, because we actually put them there. And so part of what I'm hoping the inquiry will uncover is, why is there a sense of fatalism in the Australian population that just assumes that we're going to put the scapegoats into Parliament so we can blame them for the things that we're not prepared to face. And so, but that disconnect also means that as trust gets, as the level of trust between us and our elected representatives declines, then democracy itself is at risk, a meaningful democracy. And several other of the panellists have alluded to the way that their area of interest also addresses this. And so there are, I think, a whole range of things that need to be uncovered and declared. As Chad mentioned before, there's the whole question of what we do with our money. So several of the people who've made submissions have pointed out that their children are suffering from poor educational outcomes, and we're told that that's because there isn't enough money in the budget, and yet here's all this money in the budget. As one submission points out, $100 million a day is being spent on our engagement in being at least prepared to be part of the American wars. And this person is asking the question, so why when there is so much money to spend on the military, does my child end up with such poor educational outcomes with the idea that we just can't afford to educate my child. Others have raised the idea that if we think we have a problem at the moment with refugees in the world, we certainly have the issue of climate refugees. Up to 1 billion people in the middle of Asia are at risk of running out of water. Where will they go? And how will the world and Australia cope with that? It's one thing to threaten people with being detained forever for turning up, but how will we negotiate if there are hundreds of millions of extra people? You know, the world is not coping with 86 million displaced persons. What will we do when the number surges to 200, 300, 500? Will we still be able to stop the boats, in inverted commas? So there are layers and layers that are being uncovered through this inquiry, and I'm really grateful for the incredible amount of thought that people are putting into their submissions. Some have pointed to the role of the media, particularly the Murdoch press, that seems to get labelled very clearly in a number of submissions, and the damage that that's doing to our societal fabric. And so there's, as I say, there are layers and layers of intertwined complexities that are being declared and named and described. And so the final report, I'm hopeful, will help us engage the Australian public in a more sophisticated way. Of course, the challenge will be who will promote it for us when the media is against such things. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Peter Catt. And now we'd like to cross to via video to Vince Scappatura. Vince teaches politics and international relations at Macquarie University, and his latest book is The U.S Lobby and Australian Defence Policy. Welcome, Vince.
Okay, so hopefully I've recorded this properly and you can see and hear me okay. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm recording this video today, the Wadawurrung clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since Dreamtime. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. I also like to apologise that I couldn't join you live for this final webinar event for the People's Inquiry into the cost and consequences of the Alliance. Unfortunately, I had other prior commitments that I could not reschedule. But I myself am very much looking forward to watching the entire recording of what I'm sure will be a very informative event and discussion by the various panel leaders of the inquiry, and also from the many, I'm sure, thoughtful contributions from the audience. Given this is the final webinar event in anticipation of the end of the submissions process for the inquiry, I thought I might make a few brief remarks on some recent and what I think are important kind of developments and updates in the military and defence space, which is the part of the inquiry, of course, that I'm leading. However, before I do that, I do just want to mention that there have been a wonderful flurry of submissions in my particular area of the inquiry over the last few months, which has really been heartening to see. And I would really just encourage those who haven't submitted yet to please do so before the deadline, because there's been really a lot of important stuff that's been coming through, and I've really enjoyed reading. In the first webinar series event for this inquiry on the military and defence portfolio that some of you may have participated in, and which was conducted back in early March. At that point, I gave a bit of an update and mentioned there were only around a dozen submissions on the military and defence aspects of the Alliance. But the last time I checked, recently, there were around 40 submissions just for my particular portfolio, which I think is a fantastic result and demonstrates that there is a real desire among the Australian public to have their voice heard on issues of defence and foreign policy, and particularly the Australia-US Alliance, especially given that voice or that perspective is not well represented in mainstream media or the wider national security establishment within government, or indeed the private sphere in the form of prominent defence think tanks and so on. Yes, I'd just like to reiterate that and say thank you to all of those who have submitted so far, and again, I urge the rest of you to do so. So when I spoke back at the March webinar, for those of you who weren't there, I gave a kind of an overview of the costs and consequences of the alliance with respect to military and defence, in an attempt to kind of stimulate some thought and discussion, and of course encourage submissions to the inquiry. And if I recall correctly, I made some brief comments about the unreliability of the ANZUS Treaty on the one hand, given that it doesn't provide any guarantee of the US coming to Australia's defence, and on the other hand, the way in which it was very consciously designed back in the early 1950s and continues to function to this very day as a means to ensure maximum Australian participation in any future US-led war, while limiting US reciprocal obligations to defend Australia, as I mentioned. I also tried to explain or give some brief comments about how the ANZUS Treaty, the Five Eyes intelligence network, with one of the core nodes in that network being, of course, Pine Gap, along with rapidly accelerating defence integration between the ADF and US armed forces, are altogether being reoriented for a potential future conflict with China. And that's after 2 decades of being primarily focused on so-called counter-terrorism wars in the Middle East. And incidentally, I think that there lies the significance to a certain degree of America's looming withdrawal from Afghanistan, which media reports indicate is already over 90% complete, as well as the significance of the Biden administration's attempts to revive the JCPOA nuclear agreement with Iran after the Trump administration had recklessly tore it up. I think it's a clear signal that the Biden administration is intending to fulfill or attempting to fulfill the Obama administration's initiative to pivot the US military away from the Middle East and towards Asia in an attempt to contain China's rising challenge to US regional primacy. Although it was the Obama administration that first initiated this shift towards China, it did take the boldness of the Trump administration to officially elevate China to a strategic competitor of the United States. And now the Biden administration is continuing that legacy, first laid by the Obama administration, continued by the Trump administration, but with a special focus on garnering support from US allies and partners into a US-led anti-China coalition, something, of course, that the Trump administration neglected in favor of unilateral action in order to feed popular nationalism at home. And so I do remember in that first webinar speaking quite a bit about China and attempting to dispel some of the myths being presented about the so-called China threat to rationalize further American militarization of Asia, primarily by inflating China's military, economic and political influence in Australia and across the region. Incidentally, there's been a very thorough, insightful, critical book published recently about this very topic that I might draw to your attention quickly, if I may, by Dr. David Brophy from the University of Sydney. It's titled China Panic, Australia's Alternative to Paranoia and Pandering. And that book speaks to some of these issues, especially with respect to exaggerations of political influence in Australia by China. And so in that respect, I can't recommend it highly enough. But yes, going back to the China threat, as important as I think dispelling the China threat is, or more accurately characterizing it, I don't want to traverse that ground again in the little time that I have to record this video for you today, but rather I thought I might, as I mentioned earlier, just make some brief comments about some important developments in the defence portfolio space since that first inquiry webinar in March. In fact, there's not really even time to go through all of the key developments because so much has happened. So I'm just going to focus on one or two developments, and they are around recent announcements surrounding investments in missile technology in Australia and upgrades to military bases. It's astonishing, really, how fast things have developed in this space in just the last few months, which I think is a rather ominous sign, actually, of how quickly and confidently Australia is integrating itself into America's regional strategic objectives and war plans vis-a-vis China. Okay, so the first development that I want to speak to you is the announcement made at the end of March. So after that first webinar inquiry, which I spoke at, and that announcement was made by the Morrison government, where it was stated that $1 billion was going to be spent in defence to fast-track the creation of a local missile manufacturing industry in Australia within the next 3 years. Now, the government had in fact already announced, as part of the 2020 Defence Strategic Update, that it would, over the long term, invest in a long-range missile capability, or longer-range missile capability, and in fact has been engaged for some years now in joint research with the US in longer-range hypersonic missile technology. However, the timelines during the 2020 Defence Strategic Update were vague, and they were characterised as very much in the longer term, at least 10 years away. The fact that the government has decided to fast-track the creation of a local missile manufacturing industry within 3 years indicates, I think, a serious and ominous sense of urgency about how quickly they believe they may be required to be used. It's been estimated by ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and that was reiterated in comments by Defence Minister Peter Dutton, that Defence will likely spend around $100 billion in missile purchases over the next 20 years, which is an astonishing amount, and that includes offensive long-range missiles and ballistic missile systems. This particular local manufacturing facility that has been fast-tracked and that was announced in the end of March is expected to manufacture air-to-air missiles, ground-launched missiles, as well as guided weapons used to defend ships. Now, the idea for this facility, which was explicitly expressed by Minister for Defence Peter Dutton, is for Australia to slot into the supply chains of American arms companies. So using American missile designs, but manufacturing them in Australia for use by Australia, but also to sell back to the US military, thereby not only helping to provide a niche service to America's military needs, but also to help boost Australia into becoming a global top 10 weapons exporter, which is one of this government's previously announced ambitions. What was also interesting about the announcement was the way in which the government attempted to stress that this missile facility would be a sovereign enterprise. That word sovereign was stressed several times. Now, that's kind of true in the sense that the facility will be, a manufacturing facility located in Australia, utilising Australian labour. But it's also the case that the intellectual property for the missiles will be in the hands of an American arms company, yet to be announced. And Australia will in fact need permission from the American government before going ahead with manufacturing these weapons, which of course it's certain to receive. But what's interesting is that Scott Morrison, back in 2019, some of you may recall, had sought to water down a controversial idea floated at the time by US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo when he was visiting Australia for the Osmond consultations, that Australia could potentially become host to American missiles pointed at China, American long-range missiles. After initially appearing to be open to the possibility, the Morrison government quickly sought to rule a line under the idea, in Morrison's words, although he conspicuously left some wiggle room open by stating that no such request had been made or was expected by the US, at least for now. And so with the announcement of this missile manufacturing facility, and in a kind of, I suppose, twisted expression of maintaining sovereignty, it appears instead of hosting American missiles pointed at China, Australia is going to manufacture American-designed missiles so it can point them at China itself, while still leaving open, it should be said, the possibility of hosting longer-range American missiles at some undetermined point in the future. So, Okay, that's the first announcement. The second significant and recent announcement that I want to draw attention to is the $747 million upgrade for training facilities for use by the 2,500 strong US Marine Air Ground Task Force, which rotates annually through Darwin. The rotational force Darwin, as it's known, is one of the force posture initiatives that was first established by the Gillard and Obama governments in 2012 as one of the key planks in America's pivot to Asia. Significantly, this announcement of the upgrades to the bases used by US forces came just days after the Home Affairs Secretary, tipped to become the next Defense Secretary, Michael Pesullo, warned in a highly inflammatory speech that the drums of war are beating and Australia might have to send off our warriors to fight. Not long after that, in early June, it was reported that senior defense officials from the US and Australia are currently in discussions for expanded military cooperation, including a proposal for a new joint US Marines and ADF training brigade based in Darwin. At the same time, Defence Minister Peter Dutton announced he was keen to see an increase to the 2,500 Marine Air Ground Task Force in Darwin. The number floating around is perhaps up to 5,000, but that's not confirmed. Along with potentially basing US Navy vessels at HMAS Stirling near Perth. So the $747 million upgrades are not just for current US forces, but anticipated increases to those forces in the short term, which we now know planning is currently underway. And all of this, I should add, comes after another $737 million of previously announced investments back in February 2020 to RAAF base Tyndall to support the second Force Posture Initiative. So the first Force Posture Initiative is the Marine Air Ground Task Force. The second US Force Posture Initiative is the Enhanced Air Cooperation Initiative with the US Air Force. And those upgrades are intended to support long-range US bombers in Australia. So in sum, a lot is happening and a lot is still yet to happen. And in fact, I've only just touched on some of these issues. And of course, the context for all of this rapid activity in increasing defence integration over the last few months and going back years between Australia and the US is, of course, the looming new Cold War between the US and China. And so as the US seeks to accelerate its strategic and economic rivalry with China, Australia is equally accelerating its defence integration with the United States. So I'll just end by saying that I would, as I mentioned before, really love to see some submissions to the inquiry, some more submissions regarding particularly perhaps these recent developments. And so I really encourage you to build on what has already been a fantastic response so far and to make a submission to the inquiry if you haven't already, because we really are at a critical juncture, in my opinion, and the longer we go down this path, the harder it will be to extricate ourselves from what would be a catastrophic regional conflict. Okay, that's it. Thanks very much for your time.
And the first question is from Dr. Greg Pulgrain. Twice in the 1960s, when Australia attempted to get US assistance through ANZUS, Canberra was ignored. In November last year, the former head of the Australian Army, General Peter Lee, said on Radio National that the United States had not been a reliable ally. He was talking about the Quad as proposed defence against Chinese expansion. Has ANZUS already been laid to rest without ceremony, or does it still have validity? Who would like to answer that question?
I think that's probably one for Alison, if you'd like to answer that, Alison.
I'm sorry, is that a question for me? Look, I could hardly hear it. Would you mind saying it again?
Sure. So this is a question from Dr. Greg Pulgrain. Twice in the 1960s, when Australia attempted to get US assistance through ANZUS, Canberra was ignored. In November last year, the former head of the Australian Army, General Peter Lee, said on Radio National that the United States has not been a reliable ally. He was talking about the Quad as proposed defence against Chinese expansion. Has ANZUS already been laid to rest without ceremony, or does it still have validity?
Thank you for that. I agree with Peter Lee, and I agree with the implications of the question. The point is this: if you put all your foreign eggs in some other country's basket, you are going to be sorry. You're going to end up not with an omelette, but a mess. And you can't unscramble an omelette. What Australia should have been doing ever since we attained so-called independence in 2001 was behaving as an independent country, making our own decisions for ourselves, making our own agreements with other countries in ways that suited ourselves and suited them. And instead of that, we went on behaving ever since 1901 is what I meant, 1901, as a colonial country. And it became such a mindset, a habitual way of thinking, that we still do it. We're still doing it now. And we're facing the consequences, as I described before. And we can't blame the United States for that. The United States looks after its own interests, just as every other country, independent country, does. What we need to do is join them and look after our own interests in exactly the same way. I might suggest the example of New Zealand, which doesn't necessarily shape its national interests according to anybody else's, and gets out of line with various people and never seems to suffer any consequences. It's time we had a bit of a talk with the Kiwis about how they do it. Furthermore, I suggest we could spend a bit of time talking to our neighbours in Southeast Asia about how they are managing to run their own show in their own way and get more advice from them about how they avoid getting into foreign wars the way we keep doing. They live in the same region, presumably they're threatened in the same way as we are, and yet they don't go to war. Why do we have to do that all the time? So the answer is obvious.
Thanks for that, Alison. And we do have one more question, also from Dr. Greg Paul-Grain. Since the Quad idea has re-emerged, not all prospective members seem keen to proceed. India, Japan, the US and Australia. As General Peter Lee and Professor Hugh White pointed out on the same Radio National program, the elephant in the room is Indonesia. They both agreed that Jakarta must be part of any revamped defence treaty. What is the opinion of the panel on what Canberra is doing or not doing to promote closer ties with Indonesia? And perhaps on this one, we might go to Kellie.
I'd probably throw that one to Alison, actually, Michelle, because that's her area of expertise. But I would add that an interesting development today was the former head of ASIO, Duncan Lewis, suggesting that we have to expand our diplomatic corps, and was noting that we are over-egging foreign interference issues as a result of China, which is interesting coming from him. And the other thing I'm particularly focused on at the moment is trying to dissect the arguments that have been put forward by commentators in support of the alliance in terms of what is happening right now. And so revisiting the commentators like Tom Switzer and Boyle lectures by, you were on Q&A with him actually, Alison. What is his name? Michael Fullilove, that's right. And just to forensically pull apart sort of the absurd arguments that have been put forward in support of the Alliance. And I'd be interested in hearing from people listening, you know, it's almost like fact-checking what has been said, so that when we go to mount our argument publicly, you know, we've carefully looked at these aspects, and you know, so we've got a response or retort to anything that may be thrown up by the media and others. And I also noticed a very interesting question from Peter Catt. So I'll mute and hand over to Alison.
Thank you for that, Kellie. Alison, did you have anything to add on that?
I was typing a message to Peter Catt, so I didn't hear all of it. But basically, what Kellie's saying is always on the mark, and I think I'll take it that I agree.
Thank you so much, Alison. And now Peter Catt's question: how do we fully extract ourselves from membership of the US empire without bringing a chilly scenario down on our heads? Very good question. Who would like to take that one? Alison, did you?
I think someone else should.
How about we hear from someone like Peter Catt or Ian Lowe on that? I'm sure both of them have views on that.
I don't think I'm expert enough to comment on that one.
Okay.
I'm not an expert either, but I think the comment that New Zealand seems to manage it is right on the mark, that I think the US needs us more than we need the US. They need Pine Gap, they need places to station their Marines in this part of the world. I think we should just politely suggest to them that we're an independent country, and if they want to prepare for war in the Asia Pacific, that's their problem, not ours. We should behave as if we're an independent country rather than a vassal state.
Michelle, could I suggest that Peter might actually like to respond to his own question?
Indeed.
I don't know if I'd like to, but I'll try. Well, hi. I'm doing a bit of history reading and writing at the moment, and the lessons of history are pretty stark as to what happens when a country stands up to the US empire. Take a look at the most recent UK election. A terrific article was published by Declassified UK, which is worthwhile looking at. It's one of the best I've ever read in my life, which explains how the Intelligence Defence Club set about destabilising any chances that Labor would have of getting into power. And that was on top of the threat by, who was it from the US who made the threat to bring in the Marines if the public voted Labor? I mean, it was a jest, but behind the jesting and those sort of intelligence military commentators appearing in the right wing, but not only the right wing press, we know that there's a bit of power. We've tasted it during the Whitlam years. We've tasted it by the lack of support over ANZUS in 1999. We asked the United States to give us a hand with East Timor, and they refused. They provided a ship, they provided some logistics, they provided some communications. They refused point blank to provide a soldier any troops on the ground. And they've done that before, a couple of other times before. One was Borneo, I can't really remember them all. But there's no guarantee that they'll tolerate us leaving the US empire. And we ought to be thinking about what we do to make that extraction as painless as possible. It's going to be painless. It's going to be painful, but I think we need to, have a plan on dealing with that side of things. And I don't mean, putting a ring of guards around the Opera House, the Parliament House, but more talking to people in the US who have similar views to this group and the members here, and looking at how they work to build relationships with people that have power in the US. Because if we think that waving a flag of righteousness is going to get us there, it's not. I fear. Corbyn was brought down in the most disgusting way, and that fate waits us. I think that. So yeah, look, I don't want to be pessimistic, but I just think what we're taking on, the realism is pretty stark, and I mean, we don't even have Labor on side really. So it's a long path to go, and I don't know the answer to the question I posed.
Okay, can I come in on this now, Michelle?
Yes.
No, I'm back up with the conversation. What Peter says is absolutely right, of course, and they know perfectly well that they can be destabilized at any moment, and that, quite frankly, to put it rudely, scares the shit out of them. And that's why they are so gutless, and that's why they are so bipartisan. And that's why I was arguing earlier that the only power over these matters now resides with us, the people, and making our democracy work. But here's the other thing to bear in mind. The United States might look like a hegemon. It isn't anymore. It's a declining power. Secondly, if the United States wants to go to war, it always has to have a coalition. If Vince Scappatura was here, he'd back me up on this. They never do it without one. They can't go to the Congress and justify it unless they've got other countries backing them. They can't do it by themselves. They just can't. It looks too bad for them, even though some of their generals have been making noises along these lines lately about taking on both Russia and China and winning. If they need a coalition for a war, and if sufficient members, potential members of that coalition say, we're not interested, then they haven't got it. They actually had to pay the Polish government to back them in Iraq. And apart from that, all they had was us and the Brits. It's pretty sick when they can't get enough people to even back them up on such an expeditionary war. Now, if Australia made it very clear, quite quietly clear, as we have done in the past, remember Menzies did it over Kemoy and Matsu, and we also did it when the Americans wanted interest in various other of their Latin American bits and pieces. We just said, no, thanks. We're not interested. And they say, okay, what else can they say? So to undermine a coalition for an illegal expeditionary war that is not in our interests, all we have to do is say, no, thanks, and talk to a few other people and get them to say the same. And you would not imagine how the Americans would have to back off.
Thanks so much, Alison. I think most of us are in agreement there.
Can I just add to that, Michelle, just very quickly? Peter's right. Whenever you talk about independent defence and foreign policy, it's a very scary proposition, and it's a dangerous topic, and that's why it requires courageous leaders. And I think Peter's right. We haven't chipped away enough at Labor because they're playing a safe bet. We know that the United States is our biggest investor. We know that politicians get leaned on. We know that things are said or unsaid, or a wink and a nudge, and that's what Peter is saying is absolutely right. And there are personal risks to politicians or leaders who want to run this this independent stance, and that's something that we have to factor in our arguments. And I think it's also the education of young people. Young people are always the portion of the population that stand up. They're fearless. They want a future. They don't want to be tied to the past, and that's where we also have to focus. It's the generations coming through, but it is a very dangerous topic with consequences for those who are in a position to facilitate it. You know, that's where we need to bring the young people along with us. So Peter makes a valid point, and I can't see an easy answer to that either, Peter, to be frank, apart from education and encouraging courage from our leaders, which is sadly lacking at present.
Yes, I was just about to say, what are these courageous leaders of which you speak? But anyhow, we do need to forge ahead. Just quickly, the video from Vince Scappatura, apologies that didn't actually turn out, that will be posted online at the close of this webinar. And I'd now like to, it was just to remind you also that because the inquiry will be closing soon, to please get your submissions in and let people know. And I will pass you now to Annette Brownlee, who will summarise and close this seminar. Thank you so very much.
Well, thank you, Michelle. And Michelle, for those that don't know, is the editor of Independent Australia. Independent Australia have partnered with us on this inquiry. They've done a fantastic job of publishing regularly articles relating to the issues around the inquiry. So a big thank you to Michelle. Also, as has been said before, we really do appreciate the community leaders that have given their time and their interest in this inquiry. Now, we do still have another 3-4 weeks left of the inquiry, so we're not ending it tonight, and we really are looking for you to get those submissions in. Those that haven't written a submission, please do after tonight. You've been given some pointers from various panel leaders, and they don't need to be lengthy. They can be as short as a couple of paragraphs or as long as some of the submissions, 5,000 words, you know, which will be fantastic resources as well for us to share with people. People with real expertise have written some fantastic submissions. So, you know, this is all about the future. That's just what we've been talking about. We want to have a genuinely secure future for our children and grandchildren. And that's under threat because of the policies of leaders around the world, governments around the world, whether it is climate change or the threat of war or ecocide, what's happening to our natural environment. So this is where we do need people power, big time. So I just wanted to briefly fill you in on what will happen at the end of the submission period, which is officially the 31st of July. We do have a little bit of a shoulder, so if people are having trouble getting it in exactly by the 31st of July, please do send them in, and they'll be part of the reports that are written by the panel leaders. So each of the 8 panel leaders have been receiving the submissions, as they've mentioned, and they will now, after this period of time, write up their reports. And when they've all done their reports, they go to Kellie. Kellie then, as the overall chair of the inquiry, will write an executive summary, which she will take into account what each of those areas covered has revealed, but also she will include in her executive summary the results of the survey that we've been running, the questionnaire. So as mentioned earlier on, 1,000 people have answered that questionnaire. So we've had some really interesting results coming through from the questionnaire. It may not be a scientific objective survey that we have conducted. However, it's very interesting to see the analysis of people's response to that questionnaire. And I encourage you to continue sending that around, because the more people that answer that, the better. And we will keep that going beyond the inquiry. So I think that's about all from IPAN. beyond the reports being written, and a lot of people wanted to know, well, what are we going to do with this report? How powerful is it going to be? Well, we are aiming to have it tabled in Parliament. We're looking for a member of Parliament in the House of Reps and also a senator in the upper house to table it. It will happen in the last week of November during the parliamentary sitting then, and we will make that report widely available through educational facilities, through the media, through everyone who's put in a submission and everyone who's filled in one of those questionnaires, through libraries, as widely as we possibly can. And it will be a snapshot of what people in Australia were thinking about our engagement in the wars, really since World War II. Any of those wars have been foreign wars, wars that we should not have been part of. And it will also be looking at suggestions that people have for the alternative ways forward. So an important report for history as well as for effectively making change, we hope, in the political process. We will be holding a IPAN conference in Canberra around the time that the report is released. So I'm hoping you'll all be available and interested to attend that conference in Canberra. So again, thank you, Michelle, for facilitating the meeting tonight. And thank you to everyone who's provided questions, put in submissions, and been here tonight. And please keep the talk going, because one of the primary aims of this inquiry was to engage and to have that dialogue happening more broadly in the community, through churches, through unions, through family gatherings. That's what's been going on, and we hope that that will continue to go on. Thank you, everybody, very much for coming.
Thank you, Annette.